I'd ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
And that I be asked to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are about to hit the 1-year mark since the tragic shooting in Sandy Hook, Connecticut that took the lives of 20 little boys and girls, 6 and 7 years old each, and 6 of their educators who cared for them. And it should be a source of great embarrassment to the United States Senate and the House of Representatives that we have not moved the ball forward 1 inch when it comes to the issue of protecting the thousands of people all across this country who are killed by guns every year. Even 90% of Americans agree that people should have to prove they're not a criminal before they buy a gun, that there's really no reason why we should allow military-style weapons in the hands of ordinary Americans. We should be embarrassed by the fact that we're not doing more to try to stem the scourge of gun violence that plagues our nation today. But we should be even more embarrassed if this week we cannot pass a common sense extension and update to the Undetectable Firearms Act, a bipartisan piece of legislation that has been on the books since 1988. Most people in this country have no idea it exists because up until this week it has been so non-controversial. And so to tell you a little bit about why this is so important, I want to bring you back 70 years to World War II. In World War II, the Allies developed a very small firearm called the Liberator. And the Liberator was capable of only firing 1 shot. It was a very, very small little gun, and the idea was that we would get this out to the resistance movement in Europe, and they would be able to conceal this very small firearm so that they could get close enough to a German soldier, use the 1 bullet in the gun to kill the soldier, then take his weapon. Now, the program never went very far, but fast forward to 70 years later to a University of Texas student who came up with the design of a newly undetectable firearm, a plastic gun that can be reproduced on what is now known as a 3D printer, named the Liberator, the same exact gun that was developed to be used by the resistance movement in World War II. And witness also the fact that once he posted the plans for that plastic undetectable gun online, those plans were downloaded 100,000 times in short order across this country before the Department of State used authority that they had to take those plans down. Now, I don't know exactly what the designs for this gun were, but it can be used in the exact same way that the original Liberator gun was used. A plastic gun is undetectable by imaging equipment, by metal detectors. It can be used to get into a very secure place, like, let's say, a government building. The ones that are being designed today, like the one that the young guy in Texas put online, can't fire more than a couple of bullets, but it can fire enough bullets to injure a law enforcement officer or a security officer, take their gun, and do even more damage. And so, Mr. President, we have 2 problems today when it comes to this new issue of undetectable plastic guns. First, the law which was passed in 1988, which bans the manufacture, possession, or sale of undetectable firearms. These are firearms that you can't pick up on a metal detector that can essentially move into secure locations without being identified. That law expires today. If we don't pass an extension tomorrow, it is legal in this country to create an undetectable firearm. But here's the second problem. The second problem is that this new technology that is pretty widely available already, called 3D printing, has made it really easy to make firearms that comply with the existing law but are still potentially undetectable. Why is that? Because To be a legal weapon, you have to have a certain percentage of the weapon be metal so that it can be picked up by a metal detector or a X-ray machine. But because we can now make very creatively constructed weapons with 3D printers, that piece of metal can be easily removed before it goes through a metal detector and still be used without the metal on the other side of the detection unit, thus essentially erasing the benefit of having a metal component if the metal component can just be stripped out. It's a pretty simple update that we have to make here. All we have to say is that the metal piece of the gun has to be integral to the firing mechanism of the gun, so that if you take the metal out to get it through a metal detector, that doesn't work on the other end. But, Mr. President, we're having a hard time getting that common sense update, just recognizing the advancement of technology, passed in the Senate and in the House of Representatives. So we have these two problems. One, the underlying bill, which is still really good law even without the update, is expiring. We've got to pass it here. And second, that we need this update to be taken care of. This isn't science fiction anymore. Now, undetectable firearms have always been around since the days of World War II. Clearly, it was present danger. That's why in 1988 both parties got together to pass it, and it's been extended since then. But it is no longer science fiction that somebody can just make a gun in their basement, basically obliterating the utility of all of our nation's firearms laws, and use it to perpetrate great evil throughout this country. 3D printers can cost only about $2,000 today. Most futurists are pretty certain that in maybe a decade or more, most Americans will have access to this technology, just like the photocopier and the personal computer seemed out of reach at some point for most middle-class Americans. Maybe today the 3D printer is, but in a decade or more, it might just be another household appliance that sits right next to your computer printer. Second, we know how dangerous plastic guns are because people have tested this premise. One investigative journalist in Israel took a plastic gun into the Israeli parliament, got through the serious security that surrounds that building, got into the parliament, and sat 10 rows behind Benjamin Netanyahu with a plastic gun on his possession. So this isn't science fiction. This isn't just a perceived or imagined threat. This is real. This is now, and we've got to do something about it. You know, one of the things that's happened in the wake of Sandy Hook is that schools have invested in enormous amounts of security. Now, I'm somebody who doesn't believe ultimately that that's the way that you keep schools safe. But to the extent that schools have put in more metal detectors, have put in more security platforms around their entryways and exitways, it doesn't do any good if somebody can walk through that school who wants to do great damage within it with a plastic firearm that will be legal in this country in one way, shape, or form if we don't pass an updated version of this bill right now, this week. It's time that we recognize that the future is here. Plastic guns are real. And as we approach the one-year anniversary of the most horrific school shooting that this country has ever seen, it's time for us to do what we have many times before: reauthorize and update the Undetectable Firearms Act. I yield the floor.